We're going to play it by ear, Dan.
All right.
We're going to start recording, play it by ear, and see where this thing goes.
Sounds good.
First of all, Kloppel is what's the origin of that?
I think around northern Germany.
Okay, very good, very good.
In German, they pronounce it Kloppel with an O, with an umlaut over the OE.
Gotcha. Well, welcome, Dan. Welcome to Born the Battle. You know, you came pretty highly recommended. Cheryl Mason, one of our former guests, she said, "Hey, I've got a former admiral that you really need to talk to." So you came pretty highly recommended, and really appreciate you for taking the time to do this.
Well, I appreciate you asking us, and I have a lot of respect for Cheryl Mason. So if she recommended us, I'm appreciative of that.
Because she talked about a couple of your nonprofits that you guys do, that you guys work in, and looking at those websites, I see that there's a pretty tight link between you and your wife in those.
Absolutely.
It seems like a lot of time when we talk about the next phase in a veteran's life, it seems to always heavily involve a significant other, if you have one.
Well, let me tell you the history here, and then it'll be a little easier to understand. So I was a career reservist. I did 7 years of active duty in the Navy, and then I transitioned to the reserves and also got hired by the airline. So at the end of the day, I ended up with a 36-year career in the Navy and a 36-year career with American Airlines. And I retired as the commander of the Naval Air Reserve and the deputy commander of Naval Reserve Forces Command. And when I was in that last 3-year stint, Debbie started a program called the Military Spouse Corporate Career Network. And it was all about helping military spouses get good career enhancing employment.
You two do seem like a tight team. How did you guys meet?
Well, when we met, I was a pilot for Trans World Airlines, and Debbie was working as an executive at American Airlines managing flight attendants.
Okay.
And I'll be honest with you, we met on a crew bus in the St. Louis airport once.
Very good.
We will have been married 23 years this year.
That's outstanding. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
So, you talked about you were active duty for the first 7 years of your career. Sir, when and why did you decide to enter the Navy in the first place?
That's an interesting story. I was always really good at math, to the point when I was taking college entrance exams, I got the highest score you can get in math in the college entrance exams, and that enabled me to pretty much get a scholarship to every university I applied to. And since I was good at math, my teacher said, "You need to be an engineer." So I'm a young kid from South St. Louis, and I have to agree with the experts. If they think I should be an engineer, I should probably be an engineer. So I applied for a co-op program with McDonnell Douglas, which is a big defense contractor in St. Louis at the time, and went to Northwestern University and studied engineering, and came back and worked at McDonnell Douglas in the summers as a co-op student with the plan to eventually work as an engineer at McDonnell Douglas when I graduated. And then something happened. In the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I made the acquaintance of a Navy test pilot doing acceptance checks on the F-4s. And at the time, we were producing 2 or 3 of those a week in St. Louis. Vietnam was going on hot and heavy. And I reached the conclusion that I think I want to do what they're doing. And I went back to Northwestern, and I joined the 2-year contract ROTC program at Northwestern. And they put me in a program called the Flight Indoctrination Program, where they bought my private license to see if I would really be interested in aviation. Because I'll be honest with you, I'd never been in an airplane in my life.
Wow.
And so I got a private license. I graduated from Northwestern, and I went to flight school, and never ended up working as an engineer. So this is my 1968. I started flying airplanes, and I fly airplanes to this day. I was a carrier aviator in the Navy and an airline pilot, and I loved every minute of it.
How did you manage a full-time career as a commercial airline pilot And yet, you eventually became.
Because my last 10 years of time in the Navy, along with the airline, I averaged 250 days a year in a Navy uniform. I love the life. I love doing it. And I'm very proud of my Navy career. And I do it. Every job I had in the Navy, I go back and do again.
Sure. Sure.
But I loved having an office at 41,000 feet too. So
yeah, absolutely.
I liked going back and forth. I enjoyed the heck out of it.
How were you able to manage it?
I'll be honest with you. I didn't chase the money. I did as much as I possibly could with the Navy, and I did as much as I possibly could with the airline, and with the understanding that I would still leave 8 to 10 days a month to devote to my family. And that's a challenge. And it didn't always work.
Yeah.
But that was the challenge I gave to myself. And if it meant sacrificing money on either side, so be it. And my airlines were always very supportive, extremely supportive.
I mean, a lot of people think of a reserves as a part-time job, but to get to the position that you eventually got to, it had to become a full-time job as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There was no such thing as weekends. we had a command where we were responsible for all the Navy and Marine Corps Reserve Centers in 7 states. We worked every weekend for 3 years. That was the only way I could get around to all of my reserve centers and visit and talk to sailors is to work every weekend. So I would fly for the airline during the week, and I'd work on the weekend in my oversight job of those reserve centers, and it was well worth my time, though. And Debbie and I made friends all over, literally the world. Debbie and I spent a year in Iceland. I was the commander of the Iceland Defense Force.
Yeah.
I ran the Navy's boot camp up at Great Lakes. I ran the Strike and Air Warfare Center out in Fallon, Nevada, where we train the air wings before they go to the ship. And it was a flying job. At age 52, I was a flying 2-star, which I thought was just like going to heaven. And I mean, I've just had great jobs. Enjoyed every one of them.
Now, you were a fighter pilot with the Corsair and the Skyhawk. It looks like you were a pilot at a time when, it was very early in jet engine technology, and it seemed like the Navy was trying to figure out what the mainstay jet was going to be for the fleet.
Absolutely.
Do you think that experience helped you later on when you started taking training command billets?
Oh, sure. I actually trained in the F-9 Cougar, which was a Korean warfighter.
Oh, man.
I went to the ship in the F-9 Cougar, which is probably one of the most underpowered jets you can take to the carrier. And then I went to the A-7, which the A-7E in 1973 was so far ahead of its time with an inertial navigation system and a Doppler radar and heads-up display. I mean, way ahead of its time.
Things that probably come standard now, in your standard jet.
Oh, exactly. And then eventually I transitioned to the FA-18, and I commanded an FA-18 squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And the Super Hornets of today, the modern day F-18s, with helmet-mounted heads-up display, and I mean, when we were in Fallon, Nevada, the CEO of Top Gun worked for me, so I got to fly with those kids a lot in those modern jets, and the things that they knew about the weapon systems and the equipment, and were able to teach. I mean, our whole idea at Top Gun is to create experts that could go back and train their fellow pilots in their next squadron, so that we could build on that expertise and spread it. And I'll tell you, those kids were great. I mean, I would have to go down there in the evening and make them go home. They just loved what they did.
That's outstanding. During your time in, give me either a best friend or your greatest mentor.
My greatest mentor was a Navy Reserve admiral named Ken Fisher. And unfortunately, he's passed away. But I was very fortunate when I was the CEO of my F-18 squadron. And in a ranking system, I ended up being one of nine reserve carrier wing COs. And Admiral Ken Fisher showed up at my change of command when I was leaving that squadron. And I'd never met him before. And he took me aside at my change of command and said, "Young man, I like what you've done, and I've got plans for you." And when you get a mentor like that, you latch on.
Sure.
Because he was smart, dedicated, had done great things for himself, and I owe a lot to him. And I've tried to be that kind of mentor to people that came up behind me because it's so important.
If you were to pick one thing that you learned from him, and I know there's many, but if you were to pick one story or one intangible, what would it have been?
Dedicate yourself to whatever job you have. Do the absolute best job in every job you have, and you won't regret it. And people will treat you accordingly. And I've tried to live by that because that's what he did. He was a squadron commander. He was a regional commander for the reserves. He never turned down an active duty position he was asked to do, and I tried never to do that. When the Navy asked me to, I had a policy: I will never turn down a reasonable request, and that's how I ended up in all the places I ended up. That's how I ended up in the Mideast twice.
Yeah, you've served as a flag officer for many different billets. Some were joint service, like the commander of the Joint Task Force, Southwest Asia, and commander of the Iceland Defense Force. It sounds like a unique job. Sounds like a very unique job. As a commander, what was one of the most difficult decisions that you had to make?
When I had to fire somebody, and it probably happened more times than you would imagine. Always a very difficult job, and you always have to make sure you've done the right thing. But sometimes that is the right thing.
How were you able to get through decisions like that?
I sought advice from trusted advisors, and I did my research, and I tried to make the best decision I could. And I'll be honest, I never regretted any of those decisions. They always, you don't. Nobody's immune from making mistakes, but if you, I also never shied away from making a decision. I'm a firm believer in the 80% solution. Get the most information you can get from the most reliable sources, analyze it, use your instincts, but come to a conclusion. Make a decision. There's nothing worse than working for a commanding officer who can't make a decision, who's constantly asking for more information. It drives you crazy. And I tried not to be that person.
Very good. Very good. Now, sir, what year was retirement for you?
I retired from the Navy in 2004. I got into the 2-year ROTC program in 1968 and I retired in 2004. And then I retired from American Airlines in 2013 when I turned 65. I tell people my management position here with the not-for-profits is my third 36-year career.
You obviously love doing it.
I do.
Sounds like.
I do.
Yeah.
It's a noble mission. It's worth getting up in the morning, and it's not something I have to do. It's something that I want to do.
What was the initial transition like for you? Obviously being a commercial pilot for a long time, you had that second career, but did anything change for you after that retirement ceremony, or after they pulled that flag out from the desk at the Pentagon and said, "Here you go"?
Two questions there. Were you able to adapt? Yes. Did you want to? No. No, I would have stayed as long as they'd have me because I always had good jobs and I always loved doing them. So I would have stayed. But if I didn't leave eventually, that new guy out there would never have a chance to come up the ranks and get the gratifying experiences that I did. So I understood. I mean, you can't stay forever.
Yeah.
And I get that. And I moved on. I created a consulting company and had some really good experience with that. And I continued to fly for the airline, which, like I said, having an office at 41,000 feet is nothing. It's not a bad thing.
Not too shabby.
And then following Debbie through the not-for-profit world and I started doing this in full time in 2014 after I retired from American. So
Now, yeah, you and your wife there, you and Debbie, you're founders and CEOs of two nonprofits, right? Corporate America Supports You and the Military Spouse Corporate Career Network.
Right. Debbie started the Military Spouse Corporate Career Network when I was still in the Navy. Because she had a lot of experience giving up executive positions and starting over in places. And she wanted to make it easier for other military spouses. So that was her idea behind MSCCN. And she started that in 2004 when I was still in New Orleans in the Navy. I was always involved on the periphery, but when I retired from American, she said, will you take this on full time after retiring? And I thought about it, and I closed down my consulting company, and I don't regret it. It's worked out really well.
You know, she has a very impressive resume herself as a vice president of operations at American Airlines, Concerta Health Management. You know, and she was also, I saw on her resume that she managed to operate a private brick and mortar sporting goods store, even.
Right.
And meanwhile, you're getting billets in Iceland. You know?
And she took a leave of absence from American Airlines. Matter of fact, we were able to institute a policy at American Airlines called the Military Spouse Military Leave of Absence, which is still honored today.
Oh, that's outstanding.
She basically left her job for a year to go with me to Iceland, and I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be there by myself. I mean, we did so many things in the place of the ambassador up there. I think we had visitors every week from all parts of the world. So it was important to have Debbie there with me, and I'll tell you, the Icelanders loved her.
Oh, I bet
they're a great people, but they don't make friends easily. So you have to reach out to them, and Debbie's good at that.
My wife, she's been to Iceland. I haven't. She loved it.
Beautiful place. Yeah. Well worth visiting.
Now, sir, you have two nonprofits that serve two different sectors of the veteran community. Why break it up into two separate ones?
Well, so in 2010, and this was before I was wholly involved, the director of the Army National Guard wrote Debbie a personal letter. It was on Army Guard stationery, asking her to create something for his Army Guardsmen like she had created for military spouses, and a way that Army Guardsmen could get placed into jobs in the corporate sector, because it's important for a Guardsman to have a good civilian job that supports their Guard career.
Yeah.
And so we took on the task. We created the name Corporate America Supports You because I was a firm believer, being a tip of the spear military guy, especially in the joint world. I thought, you know what, DOD money ought to go to the tip of the spear guys. Corporate America ought to be supporting this effort.
Yeah.
So we became Corporate America Supports You, and we went after corporate funding to make this happen. And that wasn't an easy task. It took us about a year and a half to get our first funder, and it turned out to be an organization called Direct Employers Association that gave us $250,000, and we started it rolling. And we had a small staff at the time, and our secret sauce is, with the help of the Army Guard, Debbie got technology from a company called Brass Ring, which has evolved from Brass Ring to a company called Connexa, who purchased Brass Ring, and then IBM bought Connexa. So now this great technology system that we use for job placement and tracking comes from IBM Community Giving. So it's served us very well. And with that technology and a handful of people on our staff, we trained many, many National Guard contractors and members out in the States to help us what we'd been doing with military spouses. We trained them in using the technology and our processes for job placement. And as a team, by 2013 and 2014, we were putting over 3,000 people a year into jobs.
Wow.
So it was a concerted effort on both sides, and it continues. And at this point, Corporate America Source has evolved into also doing that same service for the Army Reserve, in addition to veterans and military spouses. So that's how the two came into being. And then in 2019, we had the opportunity to buy a small for-profit called Vet Jobs. It was called vetjobs.com, and it had been around for quite a while, longer than we had actually.
Yeah.
And it was moderately successful, but the great man who started Vet Jobs passed away, and his widow contacted us and said, I really think that you should have this domain name because of the great work you're doing at Corporate America Supports You. And she wanted to get her investment money out of it, and I understand that because now she's a widow, right?
Sure.
Of a veteran, and so I mentioned this to one of our biggest clients is Swift Transportation. They're the biggest trucking company in the world. I mentioned this possibility at a meeting we had out in Phoenix, and the COO says, "I'd like to help you do that." So he gave me the money to buy that company.
Wow.
And we turned in 2019, we closed the deal and turned it into a not-for-profit called vetjobs.org. And just by virtue of the domain name,
yeah,
we were getting an additional 200 to 250 new applicants a week off the internet. Wow. And a lot of them were Google. And then later in that year, we found the domain name militaryspouseJobs.org and created that entity. So we set up an also known as relationship between Casey and Vet Jobs are actually the same not-for-profit with two names.
Mm-hmm.
And Military Spouse Jobs and MSCCN are also the same not-for-profit with an also known as relationship. And the reason we did that is we're starting this coming April, we're starting a pilot program with the Department of Labor and now with the VA to accept referrals directly from government entities. And we thought these domain names are things these young transitioning service members will remember.
Yeah, absolutely. It's smart marketing.
If I put Vet Jobs on the blackboard, they're going to remember it. If I put Corporate America Supports You, maybe. We've created a strategy where it's now called the Vet Jobs One Central Employment Network, and it still contains Vet Jobs and Casey. And then there's a number of programs under Casey, which is Engine, which is a National Guard Employment Network. There's the Army Reserve P3 program. There's a program called Recon.
The more you mention, though, I'm going to ask you to go down each rabbit hole. So,
I will. I'll be happy to do because they're all very good programs that have developed over the course of our progress with these two not-for-profits. I mean, and we're growing again this year. I mean, we're going to start this DOL pilot. Debbie's got a new program that she's working with the spouse of the Chief of Staff of the Army to create an Army spouse employment program. It's called Arm Me Up. And the only thing that's slowed us down is COVID, because we got these great senior enlisted leaders that can't wait to get out there and advertise this situation. And we're getting funded for that. So the programs keep expanding and growing, and the good we do keeps growing. We went over 10,000 job placements in 2020.
I appreciate your analytics. Doing my research, just looking at Corporate America Supports You, over 100,000 veterans since its inception of helping that many veterans. But I like to see the number of veteran hires, almost 60,000 in 10 years. Last year alone, almost 9,000 hires. Average salary, $70,000.
And here's the reason. We put a lot of time and effort. So the two biggest hurdles for a transitioning service member: one, what kind of field do I want to work in? Is it what I was doing in the military, or is it something completely different?
Yeah. And
how am I going to know? And so we have a process that we put the applicants through to decide, okay, what field do you want to be in? And then we have a huge number of training programs that IBM has produced many of them, Salesforce, The military has Skills Bridge rather. I think in the fourth quarter we had 726 successful training events for our applicants, because what we're trying to do here is your second biggest hurdle after you've decided what field to be in is, what do I need to do to get the job I want in that field? What kind of training, certification, education do I need to get the job? And that stuff takes time, right?
Yeah.
So we try to eliminate those two hurdles and get them ready. We take their resume and we pinpoint it to a particular job in a particular field with a set of certifications and training to go with it. And then we place them. And that's why our starting salary is higher.
Very good. Very good. So you're talking about training with SAP, Salesforce, IBM, what have you. Is this through your portal? And is there a cost to it? We
don't enter into any agreement with anybody that costs the veteran or the military spouse a penny.
Wow.
We don't go along with GI Bill chasing.
Yeah.
It's either a scholarship or go someplace else to find your applicants.
Gotcha. Very good.
We have quality training. A lot of corporate America has stepped up to the plate to give quality training to veterans and military spouses.
Okay. So I'm a veteran, or I'm a veteran that just EAS'd, and I've had someone on base just look at my resume once or twice, but that's it. Walk me through the process. What's the first thing I should do? Well,
we have two groups of people in our organization that work directly with applicants. The career specialists take them through that survey to find out what field they want, take them through the survey to find out what kind of training they need, and then they help them with their resume to make sure the resume fits the job they're applying to, because that's what recruiters want.
Mm-hmm.
They want the resume to reflect what they want.
It's logical.
Not what the applicant wants.
Yeah, that's logical.
Okay. And then we have a group of people called Recruiter Connect specialists who build a relationship with those recruiters. Because I've often have said that if a CEO of a large company commits to hiring veterans, you're about 5% along the way of success. If you're not down in the weeds convincing the recruiters and the hiring managers that it's a good idea, and if you haven't built a relationship with that recruiter who's actually going to look at the resume you send, then you're not going to have success. So our Recruiter Connect specialists are there to build relationships with recruiters so that when that resume hits their desk, it goes to the top of the heap and they pay attention to it.
Very good.
That's the way our system works. And we're constantly improving that process. We're all about constant process improvement.
Gotcha. So the first thing a veteran should do when they reach out is take that survey, figure out what job they really, really want and how to get the certifications to do it.
What field do you want first? What field do you want to be in first? I mean, a lot of people want to do what they're doing in the military. Many get out of the military because they don't want to be doing what they've been doing. They want to do something totally different. And that's okay, as long as you're willing to put in the work to get to that point.
Very good. Very good. What I thought was interesting about the Military Spouse Corporate Career Network was that, and this is important for a lot of those veterans who use VA services, is that you not only support the veteran spouses, but veteran caregivers.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they're one of the same, but many times they're not. So you talked about the biggest hurdle for veterans. You talked about the two biggest hurdles for veterans. I'm going to ask the same question about spouses and caregivers. What do you see as the biggest hurdle for them?
You're really talking about two hugely different questions between the military spouse and a caregiver, because what they have to do is totally different.
Okay.
And we've hired many caregivers to work with us because we don't have offices. Everybody works from home. So it's possible for a caregiver to work with us because they can work from home, because they're often required to stay at home with their military member who needs help.
Yeah.
And we can vary their hours, but
you used to always hear that geography was always a big hurdle for military spouses. And it
is. The fact is, the biggest challenge for a military spouse on active duty is the moving.
Yeah. Yep.
Picking up and starting off, and maybe not just a new job, but a new career, depending on what's available. And we're finding, one thing COVID has done is made work from home a whole new way of looking at work.
I think it's opened a lot of people's eyes.
Absolutely. And we've been doing it. We didn't have to make any transition because that's what we've always done.
Yeah.
But for people looking for a job, I think it's going to open a lot of doors.
And I think it's going to help mitigate a lot of the geography issues that military spouses have.
It could very well.
And it's funny how you talked about the biggest hurdle. I mean, we always knew that geography, being mobile, was a hurdle for military spouses. It's funny that you talk about the lack of mobility for the caregiver. So it's almost like the exact opposite.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
But I'll tell you, this is another story. Maybe you'll put it at the back of your presentation. But many years ago, Debbie hired a caregiver, and she was very good at what she did.
Yeah. She
had a young Marine that had a head injury and actually had to wear a helmet around the house to prevent. And it took him a while to adapt. I mean, he had a serious head injury. But over the course of time working for us, he would watch over her shoulder and eventually said, "Hey, can I try that?" And we at the time we were accepting jobs from small businesses. I mean, we have a relationship with direct employers where we have 2.5 million jobs from all the Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. So we typically have 2.5 million jobs at our disposal. But
wow. We
accept jobs from small business at no cost, but we have to physically load them into Brass Ring. And so one of the things that the caregiver was doing was loading these jobs into Brass Ring, which is takes some computer skills, but you can do it with distractions. You know what I mean? When you're a caregiver, it was something But he started looking over his shoulder and said, "Hey, could I try that?" So he would sit down and load some. But his attention span was limited. He had to take naps, and all that's understandable with his condition. So we found out that he was doing that, and we said, "Well, we'll pay him to do that. We'll pay him to do that."
Wow!
And that really made him feel good.
Sure.
And he would do more and more and more. And the real success story of this is at the end of the day, she ended up getting a great HR job because she got more and more involved in what we did and learned more and more. And she made herself a career asset for an HR company. And he got motivated enough to go back to school.
Wow.
So we created 2 success stories from our willingness to hire a caregiver.
From you personally hiring a caregiver. Very good.
We're very proud of that.
Looking outside of personally hiring someone through either of these nonprofits, either the Military Spouse Corporate Career Network or through CASY, do you have another personal success story of where you have a veteran that EAS or transitioned and you were able to place them and do?
Many. Part of our requirement for our funders is to produce success stories at the end of each quarter. And I can get you literally hundreds. There are great success stories. One that sometimes I relate to is we had a National Guardsman that got hired by PepsiCo.
Uh-huh.
And we often say that once you're part of our program, you stay part of our program. If you want to get your next better job, we'll help you do that. If you want to get a promotion where you're at, we'll help you do that. We took this young man through 4 promotions at PepsiCo.
Wow. Was that a job that he had already knew how to do in the military? Or did you train? Is that another story where you trained him up? Totally
separate from what he'd done in the military. Yeah, he just got better and better at it. And he was willing to do training and get more certifications and made himself more valuable. And he moved up the chain into better jobs.
You were talking a little bit about your accreditation, or some of the funders that you work with. I'm a gamer. It's like this, and I like to see the Call of Duty Endowment Seal of distinction on your website. For other nonprofits that are looking for funders like Call of Duty Endowment, that's what advice would you have to them?
Well, I can tell you how Debbie did it. She just, Debbie, how would you describe your attempts to get funding from Call of Duty? Relentless.
I love the aspect of this podcast that your wife is right there, that you could just reach out and touch her. I love that.
No, she worked them hard, and I'll tell you, she built up an entire fan base on their board.
Really?
The issue was she had a spouse program, and they were only going to fund job placements for veterans. So, of course, when Corporate America Supports You came about, she was all over them again and said, okay, you wanted to support veterans? Take a look at this. And sure enough, in 2013, we went through a week-long audit from Deloitte. Call of Duty has an agreement with Deloitte.
Okay.
Anybody that gets money from them goes through a week-long Deloitte audit before they get what's called a seal of distinction, and then every 2 years after they get money, because they want to make sure that their money is used properly. And I'm very proud to say that of the 15 not-for-profits that Call of Duty funds today, we are their most productive and most efficient.
Very cool.
But that's how we got that first big grant from Call of Duty. Relentless activity on the part of my wife, Debbie. But Dan Goldenberg is their executive director, and he is a Naval Academy graduate and has an MBA from Harvard.
Wow.
Smart guy. I would call him the country's expert on veteran employment.
Oh, maybe we should have him on the show.
You should. Okay. You should. I mean, he is. He's a smart guy that knows a lot about the program, but he only has one deliverable, and that's job placements. And that's what's important to him. And we work hard to put people in the jobs and make them proud. And then he introduced us to the Schultz Family Foundation.
Okay.
In Seattle.
Yep.
And now they're a $1 million funder.
Yeah.
And Boeing has been with us since 2005. They were the first company defense contractor to fund our spouse program and continue to. Mm-hmm. And then recently we've gotten a donation from Veterans United, which is the largest purveyor of VA loans in the world. And they're going to support our Army spouse employment program.
For nonprofits that are doing good work out there and maybe haven't had the same chance to get the same visibility, what advice would you have to them?
You really got to work at it.
Very good. Relentless.
You got to be relentless, and you got to do good work, and you've got to document it. I mean, having this IBM tracking system, every one of those we just went over 66,000 job placements. We can tell you on every one of those, first name, last name, military affiliation, who hired them, what their starting salary was, what they were doing 6 months and a year later. Every one of those 66,000. They're not figments of somebody's imagination. They're not a commitment to hire. They're a no-kidding job placement in a real company.
I like the analytics that you're able to spit out just off the top of your head. I like the analytics that you guys have.
We're built on credibility. We're built on credibility, and we're built on production. Mm-hmm. When the first time we interviewed with Schultz, the program manager admitted on the way out that she wasn't crazy about this appointment she had to talk to us. Oh. She just wasn't looking forward to it. She just thought we were another small not-for-profit trying to get some money. Yeah. And one of the questions that came up in the interview, basically for the grant, was, can you prove what you do? Well, Debbie pulls out, and it was no accident. She had this giant briefcase she was carrying. she pulled out at least 50 pages, would you say, Deb, of our last 2 years hires report.
Wow.
And flops it down on the desk and said, here is what we've done the last 2 years. And this is all the data on who we hire. We're not going to pretend we hired people. We're not going to give you some imaginary number. Here it is.
Or we're not going to give you an imaginary number of what we could do. This is what we've done. Yeah.
Right. I mean, 95% of the time, a small not-for-profit is trying to get money for what they could do.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And we were getting money for what we are doing.
So was there ever a question of, hey, you're already doing it. Why do you need us? And what would your answer be to that? You have documentation of what you've done. Why do you need to come to this foundation for funding?
Oh, well, you know what? I do have a comeback for that. I tell new funders this. I'm not looking for money to continue doing what we do. I'm looking for money so we can do more of what we do. We're serving this number of people right now. We're successful this many times, but we're just scratching the surface of the demand.
Yeah.
200,000 people get out of the military every year. You know, if we put 9,000 of them into jobs every year, we're just scratching the surface. There's a lot more work to be done, and we're really good at it. So it would behoove you to fund us to do more of what we're already doing, because we proved that we can do it. We can do it well.
So, you know, you're putting 10,000 in job placements. You're still a net loss of, or you're putting 10,000 in job placements. There's still a net loss of 190,000. There's still the demand still there. Plus, and that compounds every year.
The Department of Labor gets a bad rap sometimes, but they do put 150,000 veterans into jobs every year.
Wow.
In their state offices. So that's no small feat.
No.
So, but there's still a ton of veterans out there who aren't transitioning service members. You know, transitioning service members are the 200,000, right?
Yeah.
There's still a ton of veterans out there that aren't in that category that still need jobs.
Interesting.
And even in of the 150,000, there's also getting that person the next better job. Yeah. Which I'd say 35% of the people that we work with every day are looking for their next better job because they're underemployed. And I'm not sure that the DOL offices out in the field are equipped to do that.
Yeah.
You know, they're more intention to get that person a job so they can pay their rent and get off unemployment. We're more equipped to take them to the next step, to take them get them trained and tweak their resume to get that next better job. So there is no shortage of work to be done out there.
No, and it compounds every year.
Absolutely. You
both have, obviously, both you and your wife have given back a lot to both the military veteran and military spouse communities. What's your number one piece of advice for those that want to give back and they want to start something? Maybe it's a nonprofit to do it.
Well, I guess if you're not sure what you want to do, maybe try to volunteer for an organization for a while.
Okay.
We have a program called Career Corps, and for a long time, we only hired people that came through our Career Corps, and Career Corps was a volunteer effort. Because they would get all their training on the technology and the processes while they were in Career Corps, and then when we had an opening, we'd hire them and put them on the payroll. We were growing fast enough where we couldn't always wait for somebody to get through Career Corps, but I'll tell you, it was a great program, and we haven't abandoned it, and we actually got a grant from USAA to do an HR training period for Career Corps people, so that they could either go to work for us afterwards or have the training to get a good HR job somewhere else. And I'd kind of like to get back to that as well. So that's one avenue. But I will tell you, and I tell people this now, if you want to start your own not-for-profit, You better be willing to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for 5 or 6 years like Debbie did. Because that's what it takes. I mean, if you want to have a good one and get all the, the technology and the funders and the backing and the following, it's no easy task. I mean, she worked hard to get where she was with that. But that's with any small business, right? If you're, anybody that's ever tried to start a small business knows that you got to put a lot of your time and treasure into it to get it to work. You better be dedicated.
Very good. Very good. What is one thing that you learned in service that you carry with you today?
I would say that the people that you work with are your biggest asset. You might have the greatest piece of equipment in the world, but if you don't have the people that you can trust that will accept training and do the best job they can, you're not going to be successful. And I've been very fortunate. I had 9 commands in the Navy, 5 as a flag officer, and I was blessed with good people. I'm blessed with good people on these teams of the not-for-profits, and I am very fortunate. I mean, we've had people that have been with us for 10 years. So realizing that people are your greatest asset is probably the major thing I've learned in the military. Now, equipment's way up there, though. I mean, great technology and great airplanes, they sure help your cause.
Well, Navy would say that. Air Force would say that. Army, Marine Corps, maybe not so much. But
you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised.
Lately we have been getting, better gear, but, absolutely. Is there a veteran nonprofit? And I know there's a lot of them that you've worked with. Is there a veteran nonprofit or an individual whom you've worked with or you've had experience with who you'd like to mention?
Well, I think I mentioned them in passing, but Direct Employers Association is actually a not-for-profit, and they have a relationship with the VA and they have a relationship with DOL. Matter of fact, the VA had a job board, and the jobs came from Direct Employers, and DOL's in their offices out in the States. They get their jobs from Direct Employers. You would think that would be a government entity, but it's not. It's a not-for-profit. And the reason that they've been on our board forever, and they've always provided our jobs, but the reason we like them so much is they update that job board every night. You're not trying to fill a job that was filled 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And employers can afford to list their jobs there, all their jobs. So it's a great asset for us.
How does your job board differ from like an Indeed or a Monster, or is it, or a Glassdoor? Is it because it's more tailored and it's more accurate?
There are more jobs because they're not paying to have their jobs there. They pay like a yearly fee to be members of Direct Employers, and for that they get all their jobs listed, not just a handful, and it's updated every night. So it's there's all their jobs all year long. Plus, they get the expertise of OFCCP experts and other HR experts that are on that staff. We refer them all the time.
So you're saying there's more jobs on that job board than what you would see at a Indeed or a Glassdoor or a LinkedIn.
And the reason there's more is because you have to pay a fee on all those for-profits.
Yeah.
And you pay by the job or by the few jobs. You don't do that at Direct Employers.
Interesting. Didn't know that. Okay, Dan, sir, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that I may have missed or didn't ask that you think is important to share?
Well, let me think about it. I always am afraid I left somebody out. Some of our other funders are McCormick Foundation, Heights Family Foundation, Prudential, Walmart. We get a lot of support out there in corporate America.
No, it's smart marketing. Putting corporate America supports you. It's like kind of putting the onus on them. Like, hey,
I think that's where it belongs. I really do.
Yeah. No, it was smart marketing. Well, a lot of veterans, this is the VA's podcast. A lot of veterans listen to this podcast. a lot of VA employees listen to this podcast. Do you might maybe have a message for them, like a parting shot, parting piece of wisdom?
Well, I'll be honest. I am registered with the VA. I think they do a great job. I think they've gotten a lot better. I just went to a VA clinic over in Cape Coral to get blood tests the other day, and it was just a great facility with nice people who got me in on time and got me out on time, and they were very professional. They had some lines going on for getting the virus shots out there.
It's good to hear.
I mean, I think they do a great service for veterans on the benefits and the healthcare side.